Welcome to Macros starting with UPROPERTY. By that, I'm talking about, we're introducing you to macros, and the first one we're going to introduce you to is a UPROPERTY. So in this video, we're going to explain that a macro is a programmed cut and paste operation that happens before compile time. Oh, I just did explain it. This happens before the code is compiled. This can unlock some pretty powerful functionality, but we don't get code complete as standard. Our IDE will not fill out the macro for us, so we have to be super careful about what we type. It can also create some really weird build errors, so we need to watch that. We can't avoid them, though. We can't use Unreal C++ without getting into macros heavily. And at the end, we're going to do something called exposing a trigger volume pointer to the details window. What does that mean? Well, it means that by the end of the video, I'll have created another door like this. We'll have something called a trigger volume in the world here, and that trigger volume will actually be associated to the open door component of both of these doors like this, so as a pressure plate. So what we're working towards is being able to stand on the pressure plate and open both of the doors. Pretty cool, hey? So I'm going to start by giving you an example, which is allowing us to specify the open angle of the door. I'm going to make it private from the point of the code privacy, because well, firstly, it's a property. It's just going to be a float open angle like that. And we better default it to something sensible in the code, like 90 degrees, maybe, if I can type straight. Okay, now the thing about that is it's private, which means that other methods can't just set it, which is good, because we want to use getters and setters as discussed before. But here's something cool that we can actually do. Watch this. We can use something called a UPROPERTY. Now, this is a macro. And what this means is it's going to do some strange cut and paste on our code before, I'm talking and typing at the same time, before it actually compiles. And you don't even put a semicolon on the end. If we say UPROPERTY like that, then you can read all about UPROPERTYs over here. UPROPERTY, Unreal, and then here you go. The Unreal documentation will tell you all about it in much more boring detail than I'm going to. But if we make this thing a UPROPERTY, and we say visible anywhere, now bear in mind that these things will not be in autocomplete for you because Visual Studio doesn't understand what's going on. If you want to know what's possible in UPROPERTYs, then you're going to need to use a Google search, right? And if you find the right one of these, then you're going to be able to find property specifiers perhaps, and down here visible instance only, visible anywhere, and you can see what that says. Okay, so I'm going to make this thing visible anywhere and see what it does. And then we'll see what a UPROPERTY does. Visible anywhere, I'm going to paste that in because I want to make sure I've spelt it right, which I probably hadn't. I think I put an A in here. Now I'm going to build the project. Now I warn you, if you get anything wrong with one of these things, then you're going to get horrible, weird, indecipherable build errors because of when this happens in the compile time. You need to make sure that the UPROPERTY, like these, you need to make sure that the UPROPERTY does not have a space after it, that it's immediately above the thing you're trying to set as a UPROPERTY, that everything is spelt correctly. So let's see what the problem is. It's good news if you get problems in the actual file, the opendoor.h in this case, because they're likely to be easy to understand. And the problem here is that I need a 90 point at least, or 0.0. That's what it was complaining about, all right? So that's an easy one to solve because it is giving us an error in the actual syntax of our code in this file. If we make an error in the spelling of UPROPERTY or visible anywhere or something, we'll get a weird error. And it's very, very likely if you've just added a macro that you haven't added it right. Let's see what it does. It's compiled, and over in Unreal, we see that we have a non-editable open angle that is defaulted to 90 degrees. If you want to make this editable for later, well, you'll see how to do that after the coming challenge. So that's pretty cool, right? We can now see things from our code in the inspector whilst keeping them private as far as other classes are concerned. They're now visible in the properties panel at the details pane, or what I will also call the inspector. Cool, so I want you to write your first UPROPERTY now. I want you to open your opendoor.h file, we already have it. I want you to declare this, a trigger volume pointer pressure plate. Now that can be private as well, and this is going to be a pointer called pressure plate to a trigger volume, which we've already put in the scene.
Now, just a quick note for those of you using an Unreal version that requires you to include what you use. The A trigger volume isn't there by default, so you're going to have to include engine/triggervolume.h, and that's showing on the screen now. Furthermore, remember that your .generated.h has to be the last include in the header file.
I want you to use the UPROPERTY macro, but this time use edit anywhere parameter. And the documentation is available there. You can click on that in the section note PDFs. So basically almost exactly what we've just done. I've nearly given it to you on a plate here, but by doing it yourself, you're going to understand it obviously a lot better. So it doesn't need to be kind of wired to the pressure plate. There'll be no actual link to that pressure plate yet, but it's going to give us the facility, and I'll show you that in the solution. So pause the video, go ahead, do that now. Welcome back, guys. So what I'm wanting to do then is do something very similar to this. So I'm actually going to copy it. I'm going to make this, instead of visible anywhere, edit anywhere. I'm not going to call it open angle. It's going to be a trigger. Now, how do I know it's a trigger volume, by the way? Well, over in Unreal, I want to briefly introduce you to something called a trigger volume. We'll look at this more in the next lecture, but let's get it in the scene now. So if you go to your modes tab and then you look down to the volumes sub-tab, you'll see there's a whole load of volumes. Volume is in a thing in 3D space. So not an audio volume, that's confusing, but all the rest of these are talking about a 3D space, and one of those is a trigger volume. You can find out more about it by clicking on the question mark. It'll take you to their website and show you that a trigger volume, for example, is an invisible volume in the game world that can be used to tell code to do something. So in our case, we're going to be using a trigger volume as a pressure plate to tell the door to open. So what we want to do is we want to add a trigger volume into the world. So drag it from the modes tab there into the world, and then you can just drop it down into the floor, and that's good enough. If we walk over that, we're going to catch the top of the trigger volume. You can make it bigger if you like, so we can't jump over it, but I'm just going to leave it low like that. And then we have a trigger volume in the world. If you go to the outliner, you can have a look in here, and under type, you can see a strict type name, trigger volume, and that is the actual type name we're going to need in C++. So the way that you discover that for yourself in the future is that I've got this thing in the scene. It's a trigger volume. We found that out maybe through a Google search or just by browsing. You go back to your code, you come in here, and you just type trigger. You make sure that this little whirligig at the bottom of Visual Studio, and there's some similar indicators in Xcode, has finished, because right now it's still going through and parsing the files. Eventually, it'll come up and give you some help. A trigger volume sounds like the puppy. Star, because it's a pointer. Remember, most of the things in Unreal we don't be copying around by value. We want to leave it where it is in memory rather. And then I'm going to call it pressure plate, like that. Okay, so no other class can set this from the outside. It's private, which is great, but it is going to be edit anywhere. Let's try and see what that means. What does being edit a pressure plate means? What am I talking about here? Well, it'll come clear right now. I'll show you the design we're going for. In Unreal, we now click on the door. Go to the Details tab, click the Open Door component, and look, the pressure plate property here is saying, show me a trigger volume, and very helpfully, it filters everything in the world outliner by trigger volume, and I can just click it. So I've now associated this door with this trigger volume. That's pretty cool. You see the power of that. From the designer's point of view, they can come in and there could be another door, and we could associate the other door with the trigger volume. In fact, why don't we just for fun do that, just to show the generality of what we're doing. I'm going to select the door frame, doesn't matter, that'll do for now. If I'm missing something, I'll just duplicate that across. No, I think I've got it all. Oh no, I missed the frame, so I'm going to grab the frame, hold down Alt, drag a new frame over. So now we've got another door here, and actually it's already associated with the same trigger volume because I duplicated it. So both of these doors are associated with this trigger volume. So this volume will open both doors at the same time. Cool, hey? So I think that's enough for this video. I just want to recap now what we've done over in here, because there's a lot to think about. We've made a couple of simple private properties. They are pretty normal to us. We've made them private because, well, basically we make all data like this, all information, all member variables private, and we use getters and setters. So we're certainly not making every other class be able to reach in and change these things. We want to keep the open door class responsible for changing these things. But also importantly, we have used something called a macro to make them, this one visible and this one editable in the inspector, or the Details tab here. When we look at the open door component, you can see the difference between a non-editable open door angle, which we could easily make editable, and a pressure plate, which is editable, and it lets us choose the trigger volume. And both of these doors are now associated to that trigger volume. The only other thing we might want to do is possibly consider how we organize our hierarchy, but to be honest, right now the hierarchy is simple enough. We've got a folder for walls, and the rest of it is still fairly conceivable, so it's tidy enough. All right, that's great. Let's commit what we've done in our source control and crack on with the next video where hopefully we'll be able to walk onto this pressure plate and have both doors open.